Hi, I'm Dr. Alice Bridges, and thank you so much for coming and listening to this talk. I'll just introduce myself a bit here first. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher now. I'm broadly interested in animal behavior and cognition, but in particular, I'm interested in social learning and the concept of non-human culture. Um, in particular, I like to look at this in organisms with comparatively sort of minimal neural architecture, so things like insects and particularly social insects. Originally, I actually started in corvids. Even before I did my undergraduate degree, I was a research assistant with Professor Nikki Clayton from Cambridge, studying corvid cognition. And I always assumed that that would be what I did after university, but it didn't quite turn out that way. I did some work with fish while I was an undergrad, and then after that, I ended up doing a PhD in with bumblebees with Professor Lars Chitka, and because the bees tried to murder me in spectacular fashion about halfway through, I'm now doing a postdoc in Drosophila. So hopefully amoebas are not next, but we'll see. But today I'm going to talk about the work that I did with for my PhD, so with the bumblebees, who it really have captured, I guess, my imagination since I started working with them. So I guess the debate that has always fascinated me the most, and indeed broad swathes of anyone interested in animal cognition, is sort of this debate about what actually differentiates humans and animals, if anything at all. You've got the contingent of people that sort of sets humans apart as this very distinct group, thinks that there's something that explains our species' success that makes us totally different to any other species of animal. And then you have sort of the other side where everyone is thinking that there's no difference at all and humans aren't special or unique in any way. And for full disclosure, for me myself, I do tend to fall towards the latter route, but with maybe a little bit more nuance. I tend to look at it like these different species have over just hundreds of millions of years. They've evolved facing totally different selection pressures, totally different constraints. They've had to overcome these things to fill completely different niches. We shouldn't, you know, expect the bumblebee to be like a human any more than we should expect a human to be like a bumblebee. The thing that I sort of take issue with is, I think, the assumptions that we make when we look at these creatures, and when we look at ourselves too. So this knee-jerk tendency we have to assume that everything humans do is super complex or some sort of evolutionary pinnacle. It's rare, it's hard to evolve. It requires like a huge number of neurons or whatever. And then if we sort of think this about ourselves, when we look at an animal that's very different to us, that looks different to us, that acts very differently to us, we tend to assume what they do must be really simple. Nothing complex about it. Their relative brain size and neural number, this sort of idea that this is the key to everything, I think, kind of does a disservice sometimes. So I guess I'll just start with a bit of this background, which I find quite interesting. In the West, we've sort of, this philosophy of humans being above animals is ingrained for centuries. So it's all kind of Plato's fault if you look that far enough. So he came up with this kind of great chain of being theory where basically he ranked humans above animals, above plants, above minerals. And this is just how he viewed the world. And then sort of Christianity comes along and codifies it further, and they put angels and God at the top and hell beneath. And that is just how people see the world, I suppose, in this culture for many centuries. And this led to all of the issues with accepting Darwin's theory of evolution. People were not happy about that. And I guess the thing that often people have thought is the thing that separates humans and animals is basically human culture. So when we talk about culture, of course, it's probably preaching to the choir a little bit, but just in case anyone is less familiar, culture is behavior that is not inherited genetically. So it's not hardwired, it's learned from others in your group. And as you can see in this quote from Ruth Benedict, it was assumed to be exclusively human for many years. And it's true that humans are uniquely encultured. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we're not. In terms of sort of its breadth and depth, it underlies all of science, all of our technology, pretty much every single human achievement involves culture. But I think what's really interesting is sort of this idea of animals having their own culture. It obviously, the West, with this type of philosophy, it just wasn't conceivable. But in Eastern philosophies, things are generally more intertwined. Everything tends to have its own spirit or essence. So often reincarnation is a concept. It's not beyond the realms of possibility for a human to return as a fish, to return as a bird, to return as a human again. In places such as Japan, where such philosophies are more common, there's far less resistance to ideas such as evolution, and this is maybe why the idea of animal culture originates here. In this case, it was Kinji Imanishi, who is somewhat controversial, I believe, in Japan for some of his evolutionary theories that came along later, but he came up with the idea of animal culture before it was even sort of discovered, before we had any evidence for it. He wrote an essay in 1952, which was a conversation between himself, a scientist character, a layman, a monkey, and a wasp. So this was, I thought, a really cool touch to discover that actually right from the beginning, bees and wasps and social insects were kind of part of his idea of animals having culture. And the essay was framed as a discussion between these four and basically concluded that, sure, animals probably have their own culture. And it was only a year later that he was proven right when Imo, the Japanese macaque, washed her first potato. So I thought that was really, really like a nice piece of, I guess, background. And yeah, we have now obviously found culture in a wide range of species, and it is understood as this second form of inheritance. So versus your genetic inheritance, which is just sort of one point of transmission downwards from parent to offspring, cultural inheritance is a lot more flexible. It can go pretty much any different direction. Non-related conspecifics can pass on behaviors to others. Offspring can pass it on in theory to their parents. This makes for a lot faster, more rapid transmission of these behaviors, and it allows for adaptation to new pressures that doesn't involve having to wait around for poorly adapted individuals to die and the better adapted ones to survive. So it can act as kind of a buffer, I guess, against the sort of pointy end of natural selection. We've got some examples here. So chimpanzees, for example, they will crack nuts with stone, hammer, and anvils. You've got New Caledonian crows. What's interesting about them is, of course, that while they are sort of behaviorally biased innately to tear strips of leaves, the actual design of these tools, and there's some examples there, is something that they do have to learn over time. So they can't just produce these tools innately. That has to be learned. Although if you get a crow that has never seen another crow use a tool and give it some pandan leaves, it will rip the leaves, just not in this specific way. Humpback whales, their songs travel like all across the ocean basin. I love the dolphin sponging behavior just because it's so cute, the putting the sponge on the rostrums so that they can forage in rough substrate without hurting themselves. And then bighorn sheep, their migration routes are also culturally transmitted, which is obviously a problem. If you're trying to relocate them to conserve them, then they've lost all of their migration route. But what you will probably notice about all these examples is that they are, by and large, well, in fact, they're all but one a mammal, and what they're doing, most of it is tool using or singing and things that humans do that we can easily see ourselves in. This is, again, sort of maybe going back to this bias. If we can see ourselves in a behavior, we're more likely to say, oh, it must be culture, versus maybe an animal like a bee doing something that a bee might do, because they don't look like us, they're nothing like us, right? So how can it be similar? But what is interesting to me is that if you were to look at it, just, the things that these social insects actually do, if you were to consider their behavior, like the farming of leafcutter ants, the fungus farming, they go collect leaves, they bring them back, they grow fungus on them, they do some specialized sort of structures within their colony that are built to maximize specifically the surface area to grow this fungus on. They can't eat the leaves, they eat the fungus. How has that behavior arisen? That is absolutely crazy to me. You've got other ants that will be guarding the forages, other ants will be building this massive mega structure of a nest. You've got others that will be cleaning the roads and making sure that everyone's got a path through it. You've got things like the honeybee dance language, probably unmatched in the animal kingdom. If you came across a group of chimps that did these things, you would not hesitate to call them, I think it's fair to say, the second most advanced society on Earth after humans. But they're not chimps, so we don't. They have brains that are sort of the size of a pinhead or a poppy seed is often used. So maybe 1 million neurons in the honeybee brain, which seems like a lot, but we have 100 billion, so not really. The mushroom bodies are where basically all the sensory integration and processing is occurring, but it doesn't resemble a human brain in the slightest. Yet we have all of these crazy examples of their behavior. So even so, people basically, and often sadly still do to this day, see these animals as just these automatons. Everything's pre-programmed. I mean, they live such short lives. Why would they need to learn anything? We do obviously know that they can learn things, even sort of totally non-natural things that they, reasonably wouldn't do in the wild. So this is some work that was done in my lab before I started my PhD. We have bees that have been trained to pull strings to extract this blue artificial flower from under this little table, so they can get to the sucrose solution in the middle. We also have bees that they train to roll little wooden balls into specific locations in exchange for a reward. And the really cool thing was that once we'd trained one bee to do this, the others could then learn through exposure to that bee, through social learning, how to replicate this same behavior. And yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that they'd be really good at social learning. They have plenty of opportunities. They live in colonies of hundreds to tens of thousands of individuals. But again, each time we sort of show that they can do something like this, everyone loses their minds. How can a bee possibly do that? So do insects have culture? We don't know, but do they have the capacity for culture? Yes, they definitely do. So this was the first part of my PhD work. I'm going to sort of go through this as I guess, background to the next paper, which has come out more recently, and I think is the one that people probably want me to talk about. But this one, basically, we used a similar design to the paper by Applin et al., which tested great tits, but also there was some work by Van der Waal on vervets as well that was quite similar before that. So here we have a 2-option puzzle box. I'll just explain it briefly. So you can see the yellow target indicates the presence of the sucrose solution reward, and you can't get to it when the box is closed because this clear lid is on top of it. You can, however, rotate the lid either clockwise by pushing against this red tab or anti-clockwise by pushing against this blue tab. And if you rotate the lid far enough, you'll expose this yellow target and you can get the reward. So the general setup that we used was this. We had an S-box that we hooked up to a larger flight arena, and then we basically presented 8 of these boxes in there at a time, and we filmed all the behaviors from above. So that's the angle that the videos are going to be. And how do you train a bee to do this? It's actually, for this one, it was surprisingly simple. So if you want to train a bee to do something, basically we gave them first an open box, and I think this example, yeah, shows a bee being trained to open the box by pushing the blue door specifically. So you give them it fully open, and then with subsequent boxes, you basically close it further and further and further over this yellow reward. And eventually, I mean, bees are very, very lazy. This is an interesting element of working with bees. Everyone thinks they're hardworking. They are not. They are lazy. When I'm being nice to them, I call them efficient. They will put the barest minimum amount of effort into getting a reward. So if that is reaching with the proboscis right under just to get it out rather than moving the door, that is what they will do. Eventually, though, it gets to the point where they can't do that, and in the process of moving it, they'll knock it with the head and move it forward. And then after sort of giving them a few goes with this, and often if they can't reach it, they don't like it and they're going to go away, and you have to give them an easier one to kind of tempt them back. But eventually, I guess they move it enough times, maybe they figure out that it can move. And then after that, you sort of very rapidly get them to the point where they're able to open it the whole way, and they will just keep pushing round and round if you let them. Hence, we put a little glue gun stopper on the back of it to sort of stop them from looping endlessly round. So here is what it looks like when a bee opens the box. If I could just play this video. So here's a bee that we trained to open the box by pushing the blue tab, and then I believe it's going to follow up with one that will show us how to open the red tab. So this is a different bee now. And then basically what we did was an open diffusion type design. So we put our trained bee, trained to do one of the 2 behaviors, back into the colony, and we let them all in together to forage together. And we did this for 3 hours a day for either 6 to 12 days. We also gave them 30 minutes of pre-training every day. So this was where we just took the lid off the box and we let them forage on the yellow targets 30 minutes every day. And that's just to keep reminding them that there are rewards in these boxes, that yellow is connected to the reward. But other than the trained demonstrator, we didn't train these other bees at all. So what does this look like? This is day 4 or 5 of a colony where we added 1 demonstrator trained to push red. Oh, we're going to play. And this is sped up, but you can see that the behavior has in fact spread among these naive observers. There are lots of bees. These are all synchronized. So this is all happening at the same time. Lots of bees are opening the boxes, and they're all doing it by moving the red tab. Now for bees, this is the reason why we chose these colors. Blue is their most preferred color. Red sits right at the very edge of their visual spectrum. They don't perceive it in the same way we do. It's sort of this murky brown. They don't prefer it at all, certainly not over blue. And our thinking was that, if this behavior was mostly being transmitted through individual trial and error, we might expect the bees to start using the blue tab, because they did discover that you could do the alternative behavior, but they always were reverting back to the demonstrator's choice, even when this choice was to use the red tab. So this was, I guess, really, really quite strong evidence that they were copying what the demonstrator was doing. So these are our results. So this was our 6-day colonies. You can see not only did the behavior spread among the other bees, they did in fact prefer what the demonstrator was doing. Even though they did find the other option. You can see in the graph on the right, some of the boxes they opened were of the other color, but they were going back to the demonstrator's choice. This does just underline how flexible these animals are. But you can see that in one of our control colonies, where basically we did the exact same thing, except there was no trained demonstrator, we had one little bee learn to open the box. So we doubled the amount of time, and we went to 12 days to see whether more bees would learn in the control colony. And in fact, they did. Crazily, in our colony C4, more bees learned than in any other colony, experimental or control, like twice as many. So at first we were thinking, oh my God, this is not culture. They're all just doing it themselves. But actually, if you drill down into the data, you can see that the learners in this control colony, so the graph on the right is only showing the times the learners opened the box, not the demonstrators. They were, compared to the learners from the experimental colonies who had the demonstrator, they were totally incompetent. They were opening hardly any boxes, despite the fact they weren't having to compete against these highly skilled demonstrators. They weren't having to compete for boxes against these other learners. They should have been hungry because they weren't getting any food during this time. So it really didn't make sense then that if they knew how to do it, why are they not doing it more? And it does seem, essentially, when we compared obviously there was a significant difference overall in the number of boxes they opened, but when we actually were comparing their development as learners, the longer that they spent opening boxes, the experimental learners were improving far more rapidly than the control learners. So here, day 1 is the day that the bee learned that it qualified as a learner, and day 3 is 2 days after that. So to make it comparable, we did it like this. And you can see there's a huge difference between the experimental bees. So actually, constant exposure to the demonstrator seemed to be key to the proper acquisition of box opening. And the really nice thing was, actually, these results closely reflected those that were found in the great tits and the vervet monkeys, which I think really helped our case to suggest, okay, these bees are actually capable of sustaining cultural traditions. So in short, the box opening behavior and the demonstrator's preference did spread through these colonies, even though bees did discover the alternative, even when it was their less preferred color. And social learning, although it wasn't necessary for a bee to learn to open the box, they could innovate this behavior themselves. It was basically key to it being fixed within their repertoire long term. And the fact that some bees could innovate this solution individually is sort of what led us to this next experiment, because we've already seen humans and animals. Okay, we know that we all have culture, or various species of animals are capable of it to different extents. So culture cannot be the thing that makes humans unique. And the debate has sort of shifted on to this idea that human culture is superlatively cumulative. So our traditions have become so complex over sort of additions of new innovations and changes and elaborations. So the final form of this behavior, although we can learn it from others, we couldn't, if we were put on a desert island as a baby with all the stuff that we needed to produce this final form of the baby, we would never be able to do it. So this is the key point. Although we can learn the whole thing socially, we couldn't have come up with that through individual trial and error ourselves. And the common example used is the moon landing. No one in isolation could get to the moon, but with centuries of achievements, scientific, technological, we were able to do it. And any one of us could learn from those successful humans how to do it too. We know that animal culture can evolve. We saw it with the sweet potato washing monkeys. They initially were dipping their potatoes in fresh water, but then they moved over to salt water, and the thought was that this is to flavor the potatoes. We saw sort of different associated behaviors with this sweet potato washing pop up. So they were stealing other monkeys' washed potatoes. So then other monkeys were starting to dig their own private pools to wash them in secret, not having to go to the sea. So we know this. We know that they can even become more complex and efficient over time as well. And there's been some really cool papers. So Sasaki and Biro did a really interesting one with pigeons, which showed that the route efficiency of groups with variable composition was much better than those with fixed or when it was just a single pigeon. But the response to a lot of these papers and findings has been very well, in theory, in this, I suppose, chimpanzees on typewriters, eventually you get the complete works of Shakespeare. In theory, one of them could have come up with this by themselves, so therefore it's not superlatively cumulative, so therefore it can't possibly be cumulative culture. But my question is, okay, maybe we just haven't designed a test that can actually get to the heart of the matter yet. I mean, when you've got something like a chimp, and all of this stuff seems to converge on chimps, because I guess if you're trying to prove that humans are unique, you're going to go to our closest relatives, the chimps, and you are going to see whether they can do it. And if they can't, well, if a chimp can't do it, how can any other animal possibly do it? If you're looking to say, well, humans are not unique, you're going to test the chimps because they're the animal that's most likely to do whatever humans do. So everything is just focused on these, and then these are long-lived animals. How are you going to design a paradigm where you can test that a chimp can or can't do this within its lifetime? And actually, funnily enough, someone finally managed it the same week that this next paper that I'm going to talk about came out. Someone published a paper suggesting that chimps can do the exact same thing. So that was really nice, but I just thought, okay, let's try it with bees. And this was the result of this. So this recently was published, which was really, really cool. How do I go about making a paradigm that is so complicated that an individual couldn't solve it through individual trial and error? When you actually look back at the tasks that have been used with bees so far, so the string pulling, the ball rolling, and even the previous puzzle box, these are single action reward paradigms. So they just have to do one thing and then they get the reward. It's clearly linked to this behavior, this one action that they've done. So my question, actually, funnily enough, this is a bit of lore, I suppose. But this was during a talk by Alex Kasalnik, who was showing the lockbox tasks that they were doing with cockatoos, which involved 8 different steps before they could get a reward out. And I think I sketched out this monstrosity or some version of it on the paper while he was doing the talk, and then went and built it. This is the 2-step puzzle box. So as you can see, it's similar principle to the original 2-option box from our previous paper, with one difference. The tab that you want to push, the red tab to rotate the lid around, is blocked by a blue tab. And you have to push this out of the way of the red tab before you can then go to the red tab and push it around and get the reward. The reason that this box looks a little bit crazy and has all of these like walls and shields and so on is because bees are incredibly good at breaking things that I try and build to test something specific. They will find another way to get the reward that I didn't anticipate, and they will squeeze and they will force their way under and break it in all manner of ways. And first of all, it's kind of embarrassing, to be frank, that they can easily outsmart me like that. But then also, while it's very impressive that they're so flexible, it's also really irritating. It's like, great, you're doing that, that's really cool, but that's not answering my question, can you not? So eventually we got this thing. It was also because it was incredibly difficult to train a bee how to do it, as I will go into now. So basically, we had 3 questions to answer this. First, can we actually train a bee to open the 2-step box, even though they don't get a reward for the first step of the behavior? If we can, then the next question is, can an observer bee that has never had experience with the box, we've never trained it, can they learn the behavior from the demonstrator? They've also never got a reward for this first step. And if they can bees that are naive solve this puzzle box just through their own individual trial and error without a demonstrator? And if they can't, this would suggest that bees do have the capacity for superlative cumulative culture, that they are able to learn something that is so complex that they couldn't possibly come up with it themselves. So first question, can we train a demonstrator to open this box, even though the first step is unrewarded? No, we couldn't do it. In short, basically the bees, as I sort of was trying to get at earlier, they're very efficient. They like things, I guess, they like to be able to see that they're getting towards their goal, perhaps. They're getting some sort of feedback that whatever they're doing is getting them towards the reward or is getting them the reward. We're not just asking them to do something first and then do another thing and get the reward. We're asking them to do something that involves moving away from the reward before going back and doing the second step. That's not easy for them. That's really not trivial. As well, bees, I don't know if they anticipate that they should be getting a reward for their behavior, or they know what they're doing is getting the reward, but if suddenly their behavior is no longer rewarded, they tend to get pretty agitated. It was almost like toddlers throwing a tantrum is how the only way I can describe it. If the box gets stuck or if the reward's not on it, what you get is the bee flying very erratically around the arena, and we mark them on the back of the thorax with numbers, and you just get on the top of the arena, and then they march off home and they don't want to come out again. You have to like tempt them out with easy rewards and please try it again. So what we had to do was basically kind of cheat our way to the result we wanted, which was a bee that would demonstrate this behavior to a naive observer. When we first started training them, just sort of going backwards as we did, they wouldn't move the blue tab at all from out of the way of the red tab. So what we did was we started training them to do the blue tab, but we put a little yellow sticker underneath it. And actually that is why you sort of have this weird kind of tail behind the blue tab. That is so that they can't see that we've taken the reward away during the training when we took it away, because if they can see it's no longer there, they won't have it, they won't do it anymore. So first of all, we got them to move the blue door by giving them this temporary reward. Then we trained them to do the red door, and once they were doing both, we started taking the reward away from under the blue door. They absolutely hated that. They would throw the little tantrum, they would march off home. We had to do it very sort of incrementally. So take it away from 1 in every 4 boxes, and then 1 in every 3 boxes, and then 1 in every 2 boxes. And if they started getting angry with us, put it back. And But eventually, after sort of increasing the reward after the red door and lots of faffing around, we were able to get them to accept, I suppose, that this was just how it was going to be. They were going to have to do both things before they got the reward. So the end result was that we had demonstrators that, although this wasn't how they had learned, they would perform the complete behavior for just one reward at the end. So here we have, this was the first bee that we ever trained successfully to do this. And you can see she's opening the box quite well. Let's come on, bee, please. So yeah, the first video where we got one of them to do it, the audio is unplayable because by this point we'd been pulling our hair out for some time. And yeah, we were just going absolutely crazy, like football fans. So yeah, that audio must never be played, I'll be ruined. But we had finally a trained demonstrator that would perform the behavior that we wanted. So second question, can an observer bee learn the whole thing from this demonstrator, even though the observer has never had a reward under the blue door? And, you know, at this point, not a chance is what we're thinking. That just, no, we couldn't even train the thing to do it. So this was the sort of the design of the experiment. We started off with 30 joint foraging sessions. So we just paired an observer with a demonstrator. And after the 30 sessions, we gave the observer a learning test in isolation. So without the demonstrator, just with a puzzle box. And if they passed, they could go and do 10 solo foraging sessions by themselves, which we recorded to get some video and sort of compare their behavior to the demonstrators. If they failed, as expected, we sort of gave them some remedial joint foraging sessions, and then we tried to give them another learning test. And if they passed, great, they were a learner. If they didn't, we gave them even more joint foraging sessions, and then they had one final learning test, and they could pass, or if they failed at this point, we essentially said, okay, that they've failed to learn the behavior. It's, if they had more foraging sessions, perhaps more of them could have learned it. But by this point, you know, it takes 2 days to train a demonstrator to do this in comparison to 2 to 3 hours for our previous box. This joint foraging sort of paired diet paradigm takes about 2 days to complete as well. Bees don't live that long. So there was like real risks that we were going to start losing bees if we kept going. So we just called it at this point that they hadn't learned. So what was the result of this? Actually, 5 of the 15 observers that we paired with demonstrators did pass the learning test. They were never rewarded for pushing the blue tab, but they were still able to learn to open the whole 2-step box just through social learning with the demonstrator. So next, the question kind of became, okay, how did they learn? Like, why did some learn and others not? We noticed during the experiment that some of the demonstrators were opening the box a little bit differently. So there were 2 kind of techniques that emerged. The first was this sort of squeezing, is what we termed it. So here's our trained bee. You can see she pushes the blue tab just a little bit, and then she sort of squidges her way around between the wall of the box to loop tightly to the red door, and then pushes that. And this particular sort of squidging, looping action would sometimes be repeated many times. The other version of the behavior was this staggered pushing. So here you can see the demonstrator will first push the blue tab, and then she doesn't take the shorter route. She's actually going to take the longer route around and go to the red tab in this way, and then open the box. Another form of this behavior, which I think it will go on and show now, the bee actually leaves the box in between the two behaviors. So after pushing the blue tab, she will actually fly away. So I'll just let that play. And yeah, are we gonna go? Yes. And she's gone, and then she'll come back and open the red door later. So sort of 2 distinct behaviors versus one which was more, I guess, joined together, more conjoined. And what we noticed was in 10 of the 15 pairs of observers and demonstrators, 10 were paired with the squeezing demonstrator. So the demonstrators that preferred squeezing would do it like most of the time. Those that preferred staggered pushing would do staggered pushing most of the time. All 5 learners were paired with a squeezing demonstrator. So what that's telling us is, of course, although squeezing isn't always going to elicit learning, perhaps it's required. And I guess the rationale behind that was that the squeezing behavior is more temporally and spatially sort of intertwined. We're asking these animals that learn via associative learning to associate pushing the blue tab with essentially nothing, not with reward, not with punishment. That's not hard. That's not easy for them. However, when the behaviors are more joined together, perhaps it's easier for them to make that association between the first sort of stage and the final reward. That was kind of our working theory. We didn't train the demonstrators deliberately to squeeze or not. This was just something that we noticed that some of them were doing and some of them weren't. So I can't even tell you what made one squeeze and what made one didn't, because we didn't train them any differently. But this was sort of a clear distinction. And then we sort of wanted to look at the observer behavior as well. So we noticed something that the observers were doing was this kind of following behavior. And this was really sort of clearly characterized. The observer would sort of follow the demonstrator around on the surface of the box. I'll play the video. Very closely, within a bee's length, often so close the antennae would be touching the demonstrator. And they'll follow them, so you can see observer 12 round and around wherever they're going, and then maybe fly off for a bit. And basically, as the sort of joint foraging sessions were progressing, we were seeing the observers were doing this more and more for longer each time. And yeah, sometimes they would follow the demonstrator around totally irrelevant parts of the box, or after the box was opened, they might continue to follow them, as this little bee is going to do for us once the demonstrator goes away. So are they associating, what do they know? This is a really interesting behavior to me. Do they just learn to associate the presence with another bee on the box with the reward? Is there some level where are they trying actively to figure it out? I mean, obviously you can't say that. You can't tell that from this experimental design, but it's an interesting question, and I'd really like to look at that in the future. So when we sort of looked at the total duration of the time they spent doing this following behavior during each foraging session, you can see that we sort of have these 3 groups. We have those that had a squeezing demonstrator that learned, those with the squeezing demonstrator that didn't learn, and then we have those with the staggered demonstrator that none of them learned. And you can see that while the duration of following was increasing significantly over, so this is it for each session, it's not cumulative, obviously. It did increase significantly over time. It increased the most significantly and sharply in the group that learned with the squeezing demonstrator. So whether this was more that the bees were, the latency to start following was reduced, or whether they were following for longer, it's not really clear. But it does seem that following behavior was key somehow to them picking up, and potentially this whole correct route of squeezing between these 2 doors. And yeah, just the most significant. It was quite a difference, I think. So then the final question: can bees solve this 2-step box through their own individual trial and error? I guess we'll compare with the previous puzzle box here. So we did control open diffusion experiments, like we did in our previous paper, where we had no demonstrators, but each day we gave them the 30 minutes pre-training, so always reinforcing them that the box has a reward in it. And I will point out that in the wild, if they were just being presented with this problem, they would not be getting 30 minutes of pre-training showing them there's a reward in it every single day. And we ran this experiment in the end for 6 to 12 days for the previous one, but we went from 12 to 24 days, depending on the colony, for this one. Now, why do we do this? I'll get to that shortly. This is just the results of our previous one. You can see that the behavior did spread. There were many learners. They were also able to learn it by themselves in the control without the demonstrator. Now, the average foraging lifespan of bees. So bees can live, they live as adults post-eclosion for a couple of months, but they don't spend all that time foraging. They tend to do this towards the end of their life. And before then, they're doing other things in the hive. So once they emerge as a forager, that's when we use them. So they're already old when they're a forager. And this paper basically calculated that bees will forage, so they would have the chance to learn this behavior for an average of 8.33 days, 22 days max. So we went beyond the average and we went beyond the far reach of that range as well. And no bee came close to opening the box. They didn't open a single tab. They just, if you compare it to, I guess, the controls for our previous box, which was a single step, similar principle, you know, more of them learned, ironically, in the control than they did with the demonstrator. They weren't very good at it, granted, compared to the experimental learners, but they learned. Here there was nothing. And a student is currently going through those videos actually to check whether the interest in the boxes just plummeted. And it didn't. It actually increased throughout the 24 days. There were more landings on the box during the experiments, and with more bees landing on them, but they still couldn't solve that box. So, sort of taken together with the difficulties that we had to even train them to do it, in summary, well, in general, it seems like if they're given the opportunity, they would be capable of showing culture in the wild. That's from our previous paper. They don't show culture in the wild that we know, but we also haven't really looked. And they may also be able to learn something socially that they cannot learn individually. So this would fulfill the key criterion of cumulative culture. So the form of the behavior has increased in complexity so much that an individual could not re-innovate that behavior individually. They can still learn it through social learning. While it is true that human culture uniquely permeates our existence, the actual raw cognitive capabilities underlying this don't appear to be all that unique, and they certainly might not be as complex as we have maybe assumed. The other sort of final point I really want to leave everyone with is it seems likely to me, if not certain, that we've written off behaviors that animals do as just being innate, based on little other than it doesn't look like what humans do, or we assume that they couldn't possibly do something in a similar way to humans. And we could be missing a huge amount. And cultural inheritance and genetic inheritance, they do sort of feed into each other as well. One idea that I've become sort of fascinated with over the course of my PhD is the idea of the Baldwin effect. And now it's going to sound Lamarckian, but it's not, I promise. The Baldwin effect describes where a sort of a learned behavior is so beneficial that selection actually acts on either biases in the behavior that assist in picking up that behavior quickly, or the raw cognitive capabilities. And basically what you then see is a learned behavior, a behavior that was maybe innovated in the same way that Emo washed the potato, and then has spread through social learning. It can become increasingly hardwired over time in this way. I think that the societies that we're seeing that these insects form, the behaviors, what genes code for fungus farming, what genes code for aphid farming, what genes code for the waggle dance, elements of that we are understanding. Well, obviously quite a lot of it's hardwired, some of it's learned. There was a paper in Science showing that elements of it had to be learned. So I think definitely the fact that these bees, even though they wouldn't really have the need to do this in the wild necessarily, they're very short-lived. Bumblebees, certainly, they survive for one biological generation and then the colony collapses. And it's survived by the new queens who wouldn't have had the chance to learn such unusual foraging techniques necessarily. So, okay, then how is that perpetuated? I think it definitely raises a lot of questions, and hopefully, at least some of you are persuaded that, first of all, insects are really cool, but also maybe that we should reassess, I think, some of our assumptions about them and what they're capable of. So thank you very much for listening. I may have gone on a little bit, so sorry about that. Thank you to all of my collaborators. So PhD supervisor, Professor Lars Chitka, my current postdoc, current PI is Miko Yusula, and all of my co-authors as well. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes. So a few people already had to leave, but they all loved your talk, I think as much as I did. And I would suggest that everybody who has a question is just jumping in and
yeah, please.
Just unmute yourself and keep asking.
I guess I'll jump in. I'm happy to jump in. Thanks for the really cool talk. Yeah, super interesting experiments. And I was thinking, so we did something similar with the great tits, where we gave them a two-step puzzle, where they had to both slide and then dial to get a reward. And the experiment had three phases where, or well, two phases actually. One phase where where both of the steps were rewarded like incrementally, and then one phase where it didn't have scaffolding, so like yours, where the first step is not rewarded. And we found that, I forget how many birds, it was like 14 birds or something, or 15 birds out of, I don't know how many. So like actually quite a small percentage, maybe like 10% of the total birds that had learned, were able to learn the complex, like the two-step solution, like from nothing, basically. But we took this to mean that it was unlikely that these complex traditions would survive very long in the wild, because if it's such a small percentage that are able to do it. So I forget if you said this in your presentation, but was it like 30% of bees or something were able to learn that complex solution? Do you think that?
Yeah, there's about a third.
Yeah, so like they have the capacity, but would you say that it's possible for these to survive? And I guess you started talking about this towards the end as well, because of their social structure and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, absolutely no idea. My sort of gut would be potentially not. I don't know whether we were sort of looking, because it is a really difficult thing we're asking them to do. Maybe these were just the smarter bees. Maybe they were more motivated in that way. I don't know why the others didn't learn. Maybe they needed more time. Maybe they just weren't that invested in foraging versus these ones that did. Whether or not something like this would survive in the wild, absolutely no idea. And yeah, probably not. But the fact that they are able to do it is sort of interesting in itself to me. And certainly, I think what we're also doing here is we've sort of jumped ahead to the end of sort of the point where the behaviors become so complex. If this was actually going to arise in the wild, I could envisage, so for example, a much simpler version of the behavior, maybe that's easier to maintain, and then something that builds on it potentially being learned like that. I suppose what I was kind of getting at with the Baldwin effect stuff is a lot of the sort of the chat about culture, sort of back to Tomasello and their ideas about imitative learning being needed for cumulative culture, needing to sort of keep this behavior with enough fidelity in the population for long enough that it can be improved upon. And since then, you know, it seems that first of all, trial and error learning can be pretty much as accurate as imitation. Some people have modeled that, and yeah, is imitative learning. That's the whole issue, I think, with the zone of latent solutions people as well, who are obviously currently having a bit of a fight with some of the others over that. So when I was sort of reading the stuff about the Baldwin effect and this idea of behaviors increasingly becoming innate over time, I mean, what's more of greater fidelity than genetic code, you know? Maybe the behaviors that we're seeing now are just the end result of many, many, many millions of years of evolution, but maybe elements of them were once learned. Who knows? Obviously, this is very speculative. Maybe this is how some of these behaviors have come about, but I mean, yeah, you'll never be able to explain to me, I think, how genes alone could have elicited some of this stuff. So I think the idea that these learned behaviors, potentially cultural behaviors, could have had an impact in their development over evolutionary time is really cool to me. And also, like, I love the great hit stuff. Were you referring, was it the Wild et al. Paper?
Yeah, the Phil Trans paper.
Yeah, no, like, really, really love all the great hit stuff. So,
oh well, thanks. Yeah, I had I'll let other people ask questions. Actually, I had a follow-up question, but I'll pause.
Yeah, keep on. I mean, I don't see any raised hands. No one unmuted. Keep on.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so about the Baldwin effect. I mean, so one thing that struck me as well is that these bees live on average 8 days, right? So there's like intense pressure actually for them to pick up knowledge very quickly, which might explain why they're able to socially learn like fairly well. But I had a question about the transmission mechanism, because this following behavior is super interesting. I'm wondering if that following behavior is found in wild populations, or is that something that only happens in the lab when they're in these small confined spaces? Or what the story was with that?
Yeah, so the following behavior we've seen in other experiments in the lab, and so actually in honeybees too. What's interesting is, I don't know if you've seen, Barbara Webb just published a paper in Current Biology, which is how the bees are able to decode the dance. So the waggle dance, the number of waggles being how far away the food is and the angle relative to the sun, etc. When they're doing this in the dark, and she found that they were actually, the antennae were on the body of the dancer, and as the dancer was knocking into them, the angles of the observer's antennae were probably being calculated, the location of the food based on that. But it was the antennae. This is obviously detecting like the mechanosensory, olfactory cues as well. So it's probably like multi-sensory kind of inputs, and it was really cool seeing that, because after I'd seen this with my bees, and it was sort of the very close following, the antennae on the body. My thought was, I mean, we know bees are drawn to each other. They do like to be where other bees are. If you've got several flowers and you've got a bee on the flower, very often the new bee will come and join the other bee on the same flower, even though that doesn't really make that much sense when one is trying to maximize their foraging necessarily. So definitely local enhancement could explain a lot of it, just being drawn to each other and then being exposed to the products of the behavior. But no, the following behavior, it was interesting, because actually one of our reviewers, we had 4 reviewers for this one, and the 4th reviewer was a little bit difficult and basically wanted us to look at some of the demonstrated behavior. And it seemed maybe that the demonstrators that were paired with the observers that learned, maybe they were actually tolerating the observers following them for longer than other demonstrators. So I think it was sort of both sort of participants in the dyad were involved in that.
Okay.
Bees, when they're outside of the hive, they do default to competition. You could probably see in the sort of the big video with the 8 boxes, often what you get is when the bees that know how to open the box are opening the box, bees that haven't quite learned it yet, they're flying down and they will land on top of the bee. They will like pull them back and try and squidge over the top of them to get the reward. There's no sort of appreciation that this is her sister. The food's all going back to the same place, so maybe I shouldn't do that. They're all very motivated for themselves. And we're actually trying at the moment to do a sort of experimental diffusion with the 2-step box with a trained demonstrator. And I did this way back before, but the pandemic hit just as we were getting it to work. So people are collecting that data now back in my old lab. But we had problems with getting the demonstrators to demonstrate. They were fine doing it with the simple box that was easy for them to learn, easy for them to do. The 2-step box, when they were getting mobbed by these observer bees that were then coming and taking their reward, after like sort of 2 to 3 days, they refused to do it anymore. And we tested them in isolation and they would happily open boxes, but if there were any other bees present, they wouldn't do it. So obviously the scrounging meant it wasn't worth it to them anymore to continue doing that. So basically we're just giving them more reward and it's looking promising. I mean, one of them almost did it. On the 3rd day of one of these sort of pilot diffusions. It was so infuriating. We had bees that would open the blue door, we had bees that would open the red door. We would only count it if they did the whole thing themselves and not be interrupted by another bee. So we were really stringent with our criteria. We had one of them do the blue door and then go to the red door immediately, even squeezing, and then other bees came down, so we couldn't count it as that bee doing it all by itself. But could it spread under open diffusion conditions? Almost certainly, if we can get the demonstrator to keep demonstrating. So that is potentially something that could impact it as well, certainly.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah,
the tolerance.
from working with this is also, I was curious about it because obviously the gray tits are not eusocial in any sense, and they're very competitive as well. And so scrounging becomes a really big well, it can be beneficial for learning, but it also can hinder it as well because sometimes birds will wait until all other birds will clear out from the area before they try to solve the puzzle, just because they don't want to interact with the other birds or whatever. So anyway, interesting to hear it's similar with the bees as well.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. Just
sorry, maybe show the videos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so cool seeing just the parallels between and I guess birds are interesting to me. Like I worked with the corvids before. Like I love corvids. I really thought I'd end up studying them, but I ended up with bees, and then they tried to kill me. So now I'm with flies, and the flies aren't quite as good as the bees. I'll be honest, but they're still interesting in their own way. But the birds have obviously they've had the constraint that they have to fly as well. Their brains can't get as sort of voluminous as animals that don't. They need to keep below a certain weight. Obviously, bees are also constrained in size, and certainly neuron number. It seems that the sort of the connectivity between the different regions of the brain is more important to them, and no one would say that a massive bulky computer is better than a small slim one that does the same thing, right? I think it would be interesting sort of comparing the constraints that they have faced, that they've had to get over this limited neuron number, and yet they're still producing kind of behavior that echoes each other. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
No problem.
Are there more questions? Otherwise, I might have one. with the single step puzzle, was it able to do like transmission chains? So not just one observing and then performing the task, but having like chains?
I guess because we just did the open diffusion, because the string pulling they previously did transmission chains rather than the open diffusion. We thought, okay, we'll do an open diffusion and we'll show that. I guess because, you know, we had situations where the demonstrators, certainly in the 12-day colonies, would die, and then new ones would learn after that demonstrator died. But because we were letting them all in, we couldn't necessarily be sure that they hadn't seen the original demonstrator, so we didn't try to claim that. But yeah, no, they absolutely could. There's no reason.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how you could keep this skill in the population, you know, because when one generation of foragers is gone, they have to reinvent it, which seems to be costly.
Yeah, this is why it's kind of surprising to me that the bumblebees, I guess, are able to do it at all. Honeybees and stingless bees, there are some tropical bumblebees that live in colonies that sort of persist beyond a single generation. They'll go for years and the queen will just be replaced by a new queen. So there's always workers there. I think that would be where you'd be more likely to find this type of thing emerging. So I'm really hoping to get my hands on some stingless bees. Not just because they can't kill me. My supervisor, back when I first got allergic to them, first of all, he suggested working with these tropical bumblebees because they have these persistent colonies. And then he told me that they're huge, they're aggressive, and they can sting through 2 bee suits in obviously the Brazilian rainforest, which is not ideal. So after asking him whether he wanted me to die, he then suggested stingless bees, and then told me the story of how for his first postdoc, he got told by, I don't know if it was his supervisor or another postdoc, that it's fine, you can just put your hand right in, they won't sting you. And so he did, and got covered with tens of thousands of biting stingless bees. At which point I became convinced that he wanted me to die. But actually stingless bees are really cool, so I'd love to take a look in a species like that, because you know, for the bumblebees, this species in the UK, it wouldn't persist. There's just no way, but they could still do it. So, oh, there's just a question from Mason. Yes, I can stick around.
So I think most people have to leave, so I would say we close this session here, and thank you very, very much for your talk. And
thank you.
Oh, it's really lovely.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.